The maintenance records for Block 7 of Varath Station's residential section were 43 pages long, which was what maintenance records were when the section had been in operation for 11 years and had the specific, accumulated documentation of a building that had been repaired and upgraded and assessed and reassessed across 11 years of the specific, ongoing maintenance that buildings required in a station environment. Ren Calloway had read them when he moved in because reading the maintenance records of a new space was what he did when he moved into a new space, which was what you did when you had spent enough time in spaces where knowing what the space was made of had been the difference between the available options and the option that was no longer available. He had moved into the Block 7 allocation 9 months ago, which was 3 months after the medical discharge had been processed, and the transition assistance program had run its course, and he had arrived at the specific, particular situation of someone who was no longer in the structure that had organized his life for 11 years, and was now in the other structure, which was the one he was building. The quarters were modest in the way of single-occupant residential allocations for people of no particular rank or standing, which was the accurate description of his current status. The rank had been retired with the discharge, and the standing was the standing of a veteran on a transit station who was working toward the engineering certification that would give him the next thing. The organization of the space was functional in the specific way of someone who had been in enough billets to know that functional organization was the difference between a space that worked and a space that merely contained you. The undershirt was in his hand. He had it in his hand because the morning routine was the morning routine, and the morning routine had progressed to the point where the undershirt was the next item, and he was at the cabinet reaching for it at 0817 when the door override activated. He knew the sound. He knew the sound the way he knew sounds that were operationally significant, which was in the specific, immediate way of something that had been trained into the recognition reflex, rather than learned through the slower process of encounter and identification. Emergency override code, administrative authority activation, the categories of situation that required bypassing the standard door protocol. He turned. Sector Administrator Sale Vorathana came through the door with the chromatic patterns he had learned, across 9 months of Sector Administrator interactions, indicated high urgency, the specific, rapid flickering at the neck and upper torso that the cultural briefing he had read in his first week on the station described as the Solvari stress display, which the briefing described in the academic language of an outside observer, and which he had come to read in the specific, practical way of someone who encountered it regularly and had calibrated the reading through encounter rather than description. She was saying something about hull breach predictions. She was saying it in the rapid, organized sequence of someone delivering time-sensitive information with professional efficiency, the words coming in the order that prioritized the action item over the context, evacuation orders, mandatory relocation procedures, the timeline, the documentation he needed to sign, the staging area for Block 7 residents. She was looking at her administrative device while she said it, which was the look of someone reading the briefing they were delivering rather than the person they were delivering it to, which was the look of someone whose urgency was larger than the interaction management capacity available. He turned from the cabinet. She looked up from the device. She stopped. The stopping was the complete kind, not the partial stop of someone managing a reaction, where part of the body continued on the inertia of the prior moment while the other parts adjusted. The complete stop of someone whose entire system had redirected to processing the new input. The device was in her hand and was not being consulted. The evacuation briefing was mid-syllable somewhere and was not continuing. The chromatic patterns had shifted from the rapid urgency flicker to something else, something he knew the reading of in the specific, plain way of someone who had been read that way before, and had developed the habit of identifying the reading while it was happening. She was reading his scars. He watched her do it. He watched with the specific, settled quality of someone who had been through this enough times to have finished being surprised by it, and had arrived at the other side of not surprised, which was the plain territory of something that was what it was, and required nothing from him except the being present while it happened. The scars were what they were. He was aware of them in the specific, neutral way of someone who lived in a body and knew the body's landscape, not with the constant, managed awareness of someone who was monitoring for others' reactions, but the ambient, factual awareness of someone who knew the terrain of the space they occupied. The oldest ones along the left side were from the Keth corridor in his third year, which had been the first year the damage had been significant enough to produce the kind of scarring that regenerative medicine's involvement could not fully address, because the involvement had come after the body had begun its own repairs, and the body's repairs had been correct in the survival sense and incorrect in the cosmetic sense. The surgical reconstruction lines across the center were from the Verath engagement, which was the one the discharge paperwork referenced as the primary basis for the medical finding. The lines showing the specific, intersecting geometry of intervention applied to damage that had already partially organized itself and had needed to be reorganized before the rebuilding could proceed. The newest, smoothest sections were the regenerative medicine working correctly, the tissue rebuilt with full assistance, sitting alongside the tissue that had been rebuilt by the body alone, and by the body with help but not the current quality of help, and by the body with the current quality of help, but under conditions that limited what the help could do. He had been told by the medical staff across the years that the accumulation was significant. He had been told this in the specific, clinical way of medical staff describing what they were seeing, and in the less clinical way of people encountering the full picture for the first time, and responding to the full picture with something that was not the clinical register. He had organized his relationship with both responses into the same territory, the plain, neutral territory of information about himself that was accurate and was his, and that other people encountered when they encountered him, and responded to in the ways they responded to it. She was very still. The chromatic patterns had settled into the specific quality he had not seen her display before, which was different from the urgency display, and different from the processing display he had seen during the administrative sessions when complex documentation required her full analytical attention. This was the third kind, the one that came when the processing had completed, and the result of the processing was something that the person was sitting with before they responded to it. He waited. "The evacuation," she said. Her voice was in the different register, not the administrative urgency and not the social management of someone handling an awkward situation. The third register, the careful one, the one that came when the person speaking had revised what they were speaking to and was now speaking to the revised version. "The evacuation," he said. "Yes. You've already survived worse than a hull breach, haven't you?" she said. It was not quite a question. It was the specific quality of a statement that was asking to be confirmed or corrected. The Solvari reading offered up for verification, the estimate present in the tone. "Probably," he said. She looked at him. The full, direct attention that she had been giving the scars and was now giving him, which had the same quality applied to the different subject. "How many times?" she said. He looked at her. He thought about the question in the honest way, because the honest way was the way he thought about things, and because she had read the layers and had an estimate, and the question was for confirmation or correction rather than for the number itself, which she had approximately. 7 confirmed clinical deaths, he said. The surgical reconstruction events were not all separate incidents. The center line is a second-stage repair of the Verath damage, not a separate event. Your read had that as 2. It was one and its repair. She looked at the center line. She looked at the corrections implication. 6, she said. 6 separate incidents, he said. 7 clinical deaths in 6 incidents. She was quiet for a moment in the specific, held way of someone sitting with a revised number. "The Verath engagement," she said. "That's in the discharge documentation." It's the most recent, he said. And the one the medical finding was based on. The medical finding, she said, that the accumulated damage to the cardiac and pulmonary structures made continued active service a risk the Corps wasn't prepared to assign, he said. Which is the accurate version, and also the version that means what it sounds like. She looked at him. He put on the undershirt because the undershirt was the next thing in the morning routine, and the morning routine was still the morning routine, and because the putting on of the undershirt was not a performance of any response but simply the next action, which was available and which he took. She watched him do it in the specific, present way of someone who was paying attention to what was in front of them, because the recalibration required paying attention to what was in front of them. You've been living in Block 7 for 9 months, she said. Yes, he said. I have spoken with you on 14 separate occasions, she said. Approximately, he said. I have not been counting the occasions. The certification program, she said. The engineering track. Yes, he said. You mentioned it in the 3rd-month administrative review, she said. The documentation for the study program. I signed the approval for the display equipment allocation. Yes, he said, thank you for that. She looked at him. The expression that the stillness had been building toward and that the conversation had been developing further, the one he did not have a full reading of yet but was reading toward. You are very quiet, she said. Generally, he said. In 14 interactions, she said, you have been polite and organized and you have always had your documentation in order. Yes, he said. The documentation for the 3rd-month review was the most complete I received from any Block 7 resident, she said. The requirements were in the pre-review materials, he said. I read the pre-review materials. Most residents don't, she said. The requirements were in the materials, he said. Reading the materials is how you know the requirements. She looked at her administrative device. She appeared to remember, with the specific, slight quality of someone retrieving the operational context that had been suspended by the encounter with the new information, that she had come for a reason, and the reason was still present. The hull breach, she said. Yes, he said, the hull breach. He held out his hand for the device. Show me the data. The breach prediction model was the standard installation structural assessment model, which he knew because he had looked at it in the 2nd month when the Block 7 residents' communication had included a structural assessment summary, and he had read the full assessment rather than the summary, which was what he did with assessments when the full version was available, because the summary was the summary, and the full version was the full version, and they were not the same thing. The pressure differential assumption in the model was the standard composite grade assumption, which was the correct assumption for the standard installation composite, and was the incorrect assumption for the upgraded composite that Block 7's secondary hull section had been retrofitted with 18 months ago, which was in the maintenance records on page 31, in the section on the secondary hull work that had been done as part of the station's infrastructure upgrade program. He told her. She looked at the data. She looked at him. She pulled up the maintenance records on the administrative device, the secondary hull section, page 31, the composite grade specification, the failure threshold that was different from the standard grade by the amount that changed the breach timeline from a 40-minute window to a 6-hour window. She read it. She sat down, which was the action of someone whose urgency had received a significant revision to its timeline and whose body was adjusting to the revised timeline. The chair was the one at the small table by the window, which was the chair that existed because the table existed, and the table existed because a residential unit of this size had a table in the allocation standards. He put the kettle on because the kettle was available and the morning had acquired a shape that required something to do with the hands. You read the maintenance records, she said. When I moved in, he said. All 43 pages, she said. It's a 43-page document about the structure I was moving into, he said. Reading it seemed appropriate. She looked at her administrative device. She looked at the window, which showed the freight corridor doing its freight corridor business, with the specific, indifferent quality of infrastructure that had no feelings about hull breach predictions or their revisions. The evacuation window, she said. 6 hours now, he said. Which means the mandatory relocation procedures have time to be managed correctly rather than urgently, which is better for the residents and for your logistics. Yes, she said, it is. He put the tea on the table, the 2 cups, because 2 cups was the configuration for 2 people, and there were 2 people. And the specific, plain logic of the morning being what it was made 2 cups the appropriate configuration. She looked at the tea, she looked at him. The override, she said, was appropriate given the information available at the time, he said. A 40-minute window warranted the override. The information available at the time didn't include the composite grade correction. You're not, she stopped, you're not bothered by it. By the override, he said. By any of it, she said. By my coming through the door. By this, she looked at him, or at where the undershirt was now covering what she had read. By what I saw. He thought about this in the honest way. The door was an appropriate response to the information you had, he said. The reading was what you do with the information available. Both were correct given what you knew. He sat across from her at the table. I'm not bothered by people doing the correct thing with the information available to them. She looked at him for a long moment. The correct thing with the information available, she said. Yes, he said. And when the information changes, she said, then you do the correct thing with the new information, he said, which you did. You looked at the maintenance records when I told you about the composite grade. You revised the assessment. Most people, she said, would have required more convincing before accepting the revision. The revision was in the maintenance records, he said. It wasn't my revision. I was pointing at the records. She looked at the tea. She picked up the cup and held it in the way of someone who had accepted something and was letting the accepting register. The temporary allocation process, she said. For the 6-hour window, the relocation will require Block 7 residents to be in temporary units during the hull repair. How long, he said. 48 hours, she said. The repair team's estimate. The temporary allocation units, he said. The display specifications. I'm working through the engineering certification program, and the study materials require a display with a specific resolution threshold. The temporary allocation units. I don't know the display specifications for the temporary units, she said. I can find out. When you find out, he said. I'll come back, she said. He looked at her. The door will be answered this time, he said. She looked at him with the expression, the one that had started in the stillness and had been developed by the conversation, and by the maintenance records, and by the tea, and by the specific, accumulated texture of the morning that had not been the morning either of them had planned and was what it was. The undershirt was already in your hand, she said. Yes, he said. When I came through the door, she said. You were already getting dressed. The override wasn't necessary. It was necessary given the information available at the time, he said. A 40-minute breach window warranted the override, which you then corrected to 6 hours, she said. The maintenance records corrected it, he said. I pointed at the maintenance records. She looked at him. The expression had the quality now of something that had found its full form. The thing that had been building from the stillness, through the reading, through the number, through the center line's correction, through the maintenance records, arriving at the form it had been building toward. The certification program, she said. The engineering track. Yes, he said. You're studying structural systems, she said. Among other things, he said. The composite grade unit is in the 3rd module. I finished it in the 2nd month. She looked at the window. She looked at the administrative device, which had the maintenance records open and the hull breach data, and the revised timeline and the temporary allocation request she was going to file when she left. Is there food? She said. It's a residential unit, he said, not a field position. I haven't had breakfast, she said. The hull breach notification came in at 0740, and the evacuation briefing preparation took until 08:10 and I came here directly. He looked at her. He thought about the morning, the override and the reading and the stillness and the number and the center lines correction, and the maintenance records on page 31 and the tea that was already on the table, and the 6 hours that were available now rather than the 14 months, he said. And you have been here for 9 months, she said, studying the engineering certification. The third module covers composite grade structural analysis, he said. The fourth module covers repair sequencing. I'm in the fourth module. She looked at him with the full, complete attention of someone who had been revising their assessment all morning and had arrived at the current version and was finding the current version significantly more interesting than the prior version had been, and was also finding it interested in a way that the prior version had not been interesting. I'm going to need to contact 63 residents this morning, she said. The temporary allocation documentation, the repair team coordination, the hull breach notification to station management. Yes, he said. That is a significant amount of work for a 6-hour window, she said. It is, he said. Breakfast first is still the correct call. The logistics problem is more manageable after breakfast than before. Is that from the field, she said. From 11 years of experience with logistics problems, he said, field and otherwise. She looked at the table. She looked at the tea. She looked at him, standing at the cabinet with the morning provisions, in the residential unit that had 43 pages of maintenance records read, and the third module's composite grade analysis completed, and the fourth module's repair sequencing in progress. I approved the display equipment allocation in the third month, she said. Yes, he said. I didn't ask what you were studying, she said. You didn't need to ask, he said. The certification track was in the documentation. I should have read the documentation more carefully, she said. The documentation was complete, he said. You signed the approval. The process worked correctly. She looked at him. You are very consistent, she said. About documentation being what it says it is, he said. Yes. He put the provisions on the table. He sat. She had the administrative device open and the temporary allocation request form on the screen, which she was going to file, and which was going to begin the 63 resident coordination process. And she was also looking at him across the table with the expression that he was reading now with the attention it deserved, and that he was finding, in the reading, to have a quality that the prior versions of her expressions had not had, which was the quality of something that was curious rather than administrative, and that was looking at him rather than at the situation he was part of. The schematic notes, she said, for the repair team. I can have them done before you finish the allocation request, he said. You're going to write structural schematic notes over breakfast, she said. It's page 37, he said. I know the page. She looked at the provisions. She looked at the administrative device. She looked at him. The display specifications for the temporary units, she said. I'm going to find out. When you find out, he said. I'll come back, she said, this time through the door. I'll answer it, he said. She looked at him for a moment with the expression, the full version of it now. The one that had been building since 0817 through the stillness and the reading and the number and the tea and the maintenance records on page 31, and the breakfast that was the correct call before 63 residents, and a repair team, and a hull breach that had a 6-hour window, and a schematic that had an optimal access order on page 37. The hull breach, she said, you really weren't concerned. The composite grade correction gave a 6-hour window, he said. 6 hours is manageable. Before the correction, she said, when I came through the door, the 40-minute window. You weren't, she looked at him. You just turned from the cabinet. The evacuation process was your function, he said. You were executing it. My function was to receive the information and respond to it correctly, which in a 40-minute window meant getting dressed and getting the documentation. And you were already getting dressed, she said. I was in the process of it, he said. So the override, she stopped. I came through your door in an emergency override mid-morning when you were half-dressed and you just turned from the cabinet. Yes, he said, most people would have. She appeared to be finding the word. Startled, he said. Yes, she said, most people would have startled. He thought about this. He thought about the response categories that the emergency override had generated in his processing at 0817. The sound, the identification of the sound, the categorization of the sound as administrative authority activation rather than security breach, the assessment of the situation as non-threatening, the turning from the cabinet. The whole sequence had taken approximately 1.5 seconds and had produced no startle response, because the startle response was a function of unexpected threat assessment, and the sound had not registered as unexpected threat. The override sound is in the building documentation, he said. Page 6. The Administrative Authority Code has a distinct tone from the Security Crisis Code. I knew what it was before the door opened. She looked at him. Page 6, she said. Of the building documentation, he said. The residential intake materials. I read them when I moved in. She was quiet for a moment in the way she had been quiet before. The held, present quality of someone sitting, with a revised understanding of a thing they had thought they understood. What page, she said, were the display specifications for the temporary allocation units? He thought about it. They weren't in the building documentation, he said. They would be in the station's temporary housing administrative standards, which is a different document. Do you have it? She said. No, he said. I didn't have a reason to read it before today. Then I'll find out, she said, and come back. Yes, he said. She opened the administrative device and began the temporary allocation request, because the request needed filing and the 63 residents needed coordinating, and the morning was the morning, and the hull breach was the hull breach, and the 6-hour window was more manageable than the 40-minute window, but was still a window. He opened the maintenance records to page 37. Outside, the freight corridor was doing its indifferent business. And somewhere in Block 7's secondary hull, a crack was developing in the composite that had a 6-hour failure threshold and a 36-hour repair timeline if the repair team used the optimal access order. And the morning was proceeding in the specific, particular way of mornings that had turned out to be more than they had scheduled. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but in the plain, quiet way of things that accumulated into something as the morning went on. The way the maintenance records accumulated into 43 pages, and the certification modules accumulated into a structural foundation, and the morning accumulated into 2 people at a table, one filing a request and one reading a schematic, both finding the morning had produced something that the morning's plan had not contained, and that neither of them was planning to discard. He got to page 37. The optimal access order was exactly where he had left it.